that this book will rehabilitate Paddy Mayne and also reveal why Bill Stirling should be regarded as the father of British Special Forces and not his brother David.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name's Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and host. And today we have a truly myth-busting piece of history. For those interested in the Second World War, and in particular the SAS and its so-called founder, David Stirling, you're in for a treat. If you're not aware, then this is the time to start, because once you've heard my guest Gavin Mortimer dismantle the fairy tale that's currently out there, you'll sound like an absolute expert on the subject. As you've heard at the top, David Stirling was not the founder, it was his brother Bill, and Paddy Mayne was the real star of the SAS. Gavin's book, The Phoney Major, is out now, so do read this fantastic tale. Now I've changed the pods slightly due to feedback, and now I'm making pods one extended episode rather than chopping them into two. So coming up, I'm going to be speaking to Damien Lewis about Josephine Baker, the wonderful African-American performer and French resistance agent, Con Iggulden, the best-selling historical fiction author on Pericles, Miranda Mallins on the Civil War and Oliver Cromwell, and Gretchen Freeman on the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. Links are in the show notes, so if you can subscribe, do give me a review. That would be so kind. I do hope you enjoyed my chat with Gavin all about David Stirling and Paddy Mayne and the SAS. Gavin Mortimer, welcome to the podcast. And we're here to talk about David Stirling, the founder of the SAS. Or is he? The title of the book being David Stirling, The Phoney Major, The Life, Times and Truth About the Founder of the SAS. So Gavin, welcome.
Pleasure to be here, Ollie. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. So this is a legendary figure, certainly in the history of the SAS. But I'm just thinking some of our listeners may not be aware of who David Stirling is. And so it'd be great for you to just give a kind of maybe a brief breakdown of who he is and why he has the reputation he does up until the publication of this book.
David Stirling is considered to be one of the great guerrilla fighters in British military history. The man, as you said in your introduction, Ollie, who's credited with founding the Special Air Service, the SAS. And he has become a legendary figure, a mythical figure. And as I explore and explain in the book, he is far from being the man of myth. He was a co-founder of the SAS. He was an ideas man, but he was not. He had neither the physique nor the temperament for a regular warfare, nor the maturity, and he. So of course that begs the question: well, why do we regard him in such a light now? Well, what he was he was very manipulative, and he was a great networker. And he was very cunning and skilled in self-promotion. And what he did, this was not possible in the 10 years after the war because Paddy Mayne was still alive. That's Robert Blair Mayne, better known as Paddy Mayne. Now he is, certainly in my opinion, the greatest guerrilla fighter of the World War II, British or otherwise, an Irish rugby British Lions international before the war, and a man of sublime agility, intelligence, ingenuity, athleticism, everything that David Stirling wasn't but wished to be. And that unfulfilled desire on the part of David Stirling led him to become very embittered. He took his bitterness out on Paddy Mayne, and as really at the heart of the book is the dynamic between Paddy Mayne and David Stirling. And it was after the war, Paddy Mayne was killed in a car crash in 1955. And that was the moment that Stirling saw he could rewrite the history of the SAS to his advantage and to the disadvantage of Paddy Mayne. And that's what he did to great effect.
So for our listeners who aren't aware of who Paddy Mayne is, and you've just given a great description of him, he has this reputation amongst those in the know as a kind of rather an overlooked figure. He's from Northern Ireland. He's from where my mother is from, so I'm immediately sympathetic with him. Plus, he, as you say, an Ireland rugby international. But he won 4 DSOs, didn't he, during World War II?
Correct, and he was the last of those DSOs. So he was awarded a DSO, a Distinguished Service Order, in every theatre that he fought. So North Africa, Sicily and Italy, France in 1944, and then lastly, April the 9th, 1945. For that action, he was actually recommended for a Victoria Cross, and it went through the proper channels. It was one of the witnesses was a Canadian general of the Armoured Corps, and along with, I think it was 3 SAS officers. So it met the criteria, and he rescued his men under heavy enemy fire who were trapped in the ditch. I was fortunate enough to speak to one of those men several years ago, Albert Youngman, and he obviously never forgot that moment and told me in very dramatic fashion how Paddy, in the back of a Jeep driven by Lieutenant Scott, roared down this country lane in Germany, behind the Vickers, the twin Vickers in the back of a Jeep, and laying down suppressing fire the Germans who were across the field in a barn. And he did that a couple of times, roared up and down this lane, and then once he'd suppressed the German fire, he got his men, there were half a dozen who were trapped in this ditch, brought them into the Jeep and led them to safety. So a supreme leadership and courage. And that VC was denied. And as I say in the book, I detect the hand of David Stirling. He was a confidant of the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, a friend of the royal family. David Stirling's mother was very well connected and was a friend of Queen Mary, and it's very odd how this Paddy Mayne's VC suddenly downgraded to a DSO. But that's very much in keeping with Stirling, who, as I said, was embittered and envious. And to answer your question, Ollie, yes, Paddy Mayne was someone who was made for this sort of warfare, for the SAS warfare. He was a brilliant sportsman, not just rugby, but a champion university boxer, a very good cricketer, and he was just able to. He was a half a yard ahead of the enemy in both mind and body. People I spoke to, veterans who fought with me, told me that he just seemed to anticipate what the Germans were going to do in any given contact, and was therefore able to outwit them every time. And he wasn't a fearless man. He was a man who was able to control his fear, and not just control it, but to act with great presence of mind, with a clarity of mind, utter composure in the most high-pressured situation. And this is why, as I said earlier, it's I suppose one may say it's some claim to say that he was Britain's greatest guerrilla fighter. Of course, always hard to measure these such descriptions, but in my opinion, he was, and he was also a great leader of men. And from the very start of the SAS's formation in the summer of 1941, he was a psychological leader. Stirling was the leader in rank, but it was Mayne to whom the men looked up to, who inspired them and who gave them the courage and yes, the inspiration in action.
So David Stirling certainly sold himself as having founded the SAS, and it's a little bit of a complicated story, actually. I find as coming from it cold, because you have the long range desert group, you have 5 Commando, I think it was. Correct me if I'm wrong, and then out of those groups, there's a training center run by David Stirling's brother Bill. And out of that, they moved to, and I know you're going to describe it a lot better, but out of those kind of elite groups, the SAS is formed. Could you just talk a little bit about how the SAS is formed?
Yeah, certainly. To go back, you mentioned Bill Stirling there, who is the other marginalised figure, even more so in a way than Paddy Mayne, because people are aware of Paddy Mayne, but very few people are aware of Bill Stirling's contribution to the SAS. And if you pick up a general history of the SAS and go to the index, you'll see Bill Stirling will have a couple of pages listed, indexed next to his name. And yet, really, as I say in the book, it's Bill who is the father of British Special Forces, not just the SAS. So why do I say that? Well, in April 1940, Operation Knife was launched. This was a 6-man operation to go to Norway, which was had recently been invaded by the Germans, and to coordinate with Norwegian partisans in sabotaging railway lines south of Bergen. And one of the 6 men, Bill Stirling, who at the beginning of 1940 had joined Military Intelligence Research, MIR, which was a forerunner of the Special Operations Executive, better known as SOE. And they set off at the end of April 1940 from Rosyth in Scotland to Norway, but halfway across the submarine hit a surface mine and they were forced to return to Scotland. The submarine, a new submarine was required. Bill Stirling said, well, come on, let's go back to my place and wait until the new submarine is found. The new submarine was never, the operation was abandoned because of a situation in Norway with the Allies withdrawing from Norway. Bill Stirling, the Stirling family I mentioned earlier were aristocratic. Bill, the eldest of 6 siblings, was the laird. General Archibald Stirling, who had fought in the South African War of 1899 to 1902 and the First World War. He had died just a few months before Bill turned 21. So at a young age, he inherited land, money, and power. And again, this is integral to the story.
There's a sorry to interrupt you, but there is a lot of class in this story, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely, there is a lot of class. SOE at the time, and in fact the British military in general, particularly the army, was very much an old boys network. MDR Foote, who is the SOE historian, said that SOE was formed on the basis of not just military connections, the old boy network, but city connections. So you would have the extraordinary case of people being employed by SOE purely because they work for the right bank in the city, no military experience. So it was like that. And of course, the Stirlings were one of the most influential landowning families in Scotland. The Honourable Mrs. Stirling, who was the daughter of the 13th Lord Lovett. So we've got another family connection there with the Lovets. The 15th Lord Lovett was, of course, the great commando officer, the cousin of David and Bill Stirling.
He appears in The Longest Day. Sorry, I keep on interrupting you, so you can tell me off. But
yes,
he appears in The Longest Day with the bagpipe in a
exactly,
white Polo neck sweater.
Exactly, but he was the CO of Number 4 Commando, who came ashore on D-Day and then marched inland a few miles to Pegasus Bridge and to hold the bridges until the arrival of the main British infantry. And so that's right. So the class does come into it. Now, Bill Stirling was, I suppose, because he from age 20 he became laird of Keir, which is the Stirling estate. So not just outside Dunblane in central Scotland. He had the common touch. He was equally skilled at talking to princes and prime ministers as he was his garden staff, his domestic staff. David Stirling was not. He was a snob. He was uncomfortable outside the upper class, didn't really know how to relate to the working class because, of course, he was not used to that environment. He had gone from, he went to a prep school at Ampleforth, the Yorkshire boarding school, and then he went from there to Cambridge for 3 terms. He wasn't a success at Cambridge. So he'd never had a proper job, so to speak, before the outbreak of war. Anyway, to go back to Bill Stirling. So in April 1940, the first, I suppose, SOE Operation Knife had ended in failure. But what it had taught the 6 men, particularly Bill, and it was Bill Stirling who recognised this, was how inadequately they had been prepared for this irregular warfare. He'd actually taken his ghillie, his gamekeeper, on the submarine because he was skilled in the art of stalking, of moving quickly and quietly across a rough terrain, because they hadn't been taught this. So Bill Stirling said to the other 5, I think we should set up a guerrilla warfare school. And he, using his connections, he pitched this idea in May 1940 to the War Office. He went down to London. Fortuitously, Winston Churchill had just replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister. Churchill had always been, from his days as a reporter in the Boer War in the turn of a century, a fan of irregular warfare. He'd seen how superbly the Boers had used it against the British. And so Bill's idea for a guerrilla warfare came at just the right time. He was authorised to set it up. By this time, he brought on board Lord Lovett, his cousin, who said, well, I've got my land in the northwest of Scotland, which is ideal for guerrilla warfare. It's got lochs, it's got the sea, it's got mountains, it's got moorland, perfect for what we have in mind. So June the 3rd, 1940, the Special Training Centre was opened. Bill Stirling was the chief instructor along with Lord Lovett. And he brought on board, it was extraordinary, some of the most the leading experts in their field. So, for example, you had the 1924 Olympic shooting gold medalist, and you had Jim Gavin, who was an expert, had been on the 1936 Everest expedition. You had Freddie Spencer Chapman, who was an Arctic explorer and was actually a schoolmaster at Gordonston at the outbreak of war, among whom one of his pupils was later the Duke of Edinburgh. Mike Calvert, a sapper, a demolitions expert. So all these people came together. And throughout the summer of 1940 and the autumn of 1940, they taught hundreds of new commando officers and NCOs on a 2-week course, giving them a thorough grounding in guerrilla warfare. And one of the recruits was David Stirling, and he then subsequently joined Number 8 Commando, Guards Commando, and that was very much comprised of the upper class. And then in January 1941, a new force, as you said, it's a bit confusing, Ollie. A new force was raised, Lay Force, under command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Laycock, and this Lay Force was comprised of 3 commando troops: Number 8 Commando, which was David Stirling's; Number 7 Commando, which was generally infantry made up of volunteers from infantry regiments; and 11 Scottish Commando. And in Number 11 Scottish Commando was Paddy Mayne. And the 3 of them sailed to the Middle East at the end of January 1941 with the expectation of launching amphibious raids against the Italians in North Africa. But of course, by the time they got there, the Italians had been joined by Rommel's Afrika Korps, and this completely changed the complexion of the war in North Africa. And just to bring it up to sort of the beginning of the SAS, throughout the summer of 1941, there were a series of aborted raids. Frustration grew, and in June 1941, Ley Force was disbanded, and the intention was to return the volunteers to their parent regiment, and this is when the SAS was formed. You mentioned the Long Range Desert Group, very important to this story, and they were the pioneers of British Special Forces in World War II, mainly concerned with reconnaissance. They were formed at Ragnold in June 1940, and they did extraordinary work in mapping the interior of the Libyan desert. Bagnold in the 1920s had been a regular army officer and had been the first white man to penetrate to the heart of the Libyan desert, to places like Kufra and Siwa Oasis, and so they were considered the kings of the desert and as I said, the pioneers of British Special Forces warfare in up until the creation, I suppose, of the SAS in August 1941.
Now, what's quite interesting in the book is during this period when the Long Range Desert Group are doing all their operations, David Stirling, he seems to have secured a flat in Cairo and is frequenting the bars of Cairo. It seems like quite a nice life for a Special Forces soldier.
Well, that's right. He was Evelyn Waugh, by the way, was as a name I didn't mention. He was also an officer in Ley Force, and he described Stirling and the other upper class officers as the smart set, and they would really had a great time in the summer of 1941 in Cairo. Gambling, there was a race course, there was several very high class establishments, be they brothels or bars or cafes. One of the most popular places for officers was the terrace of a Shepherd's Hotel, and it was quite incestuous, I suppose, in a way. And that's right. Peter Stirling, he was the second of the four Stirling brothers. There was Bill, Peter, David, and Hugh. Hugh was killed in active service in North Africa in the spring of 1941. Peter was probably the most gifted, certainly intellectually, of the four Stirling brothers, and he was a secretary at the British Embassy in Cairo and had a flat in the swankiest area of the Egyptian capital. And Bill and David, Bill Stirling was also out in Cairo in 1941 with SOE, and the three of them really set up home, and they had some wild parties at their flat, and it was a rather dissolute lifestyle, I suppose. The war had become a little bit static, and as I said, Ley Force, the reason that the commandos were out there was in the process of being disbanded. There was this inertia out there, and so out of that comes the SAS. Now, David Stirling, as a Scots Guards officer, what he was at the beginning of the war, had acquired a reputation for being supremely lazy. The giant sloth, he was nicknamed. He gambled, he drank a lot. He went to nightclubs in London when he was based at the Guards depot, and he really didn't take soldiering very seriously. So one of the great, I suppose, puzzles for me, having written about the SAS for a number of years, is how did such a character come to, if the myth is to be believed, this extraordinary guerrilla fighter? Well, let me introduce you to Bill Stirling, because as I said, he had gone out to Egypt at the same time as David Stirling and this Lay Force Commando Force. He'd gone out there with SOE on something, the Yak mission. Now, this was codenamed for an operation where they were, the hope was to raise an anti-fascist battalion of Italians from among the captured POWs. But the Italians were utterly apathetic. They were quite pleased to be captured. They said, no thanks. We want to sit out the rest of the war as POWs. So Bill then became very disillusioned with SOE in Cairo and got a job as the best way of describing it is the private secretary to Lieutenant General Arthur Smith, who was the chief of the general staff and answered to Wavell, who was commander-in-chief Middle East, Archibald Wavell. So Bill was at the heart of Middle East headquarters. And what Bill had seen very early on in the North African campaign was the long-range desert group were doing great things with their reconnaissance, but there was an opportunity for a guerrilla force to operate deep in the desert behind enemy lines. And drawing on his experience of 1940 and of raising the Special Training Centre, the Guerrilla Warfare School in Scotland, he suggested to David that there was potential for this force. And together, the two of them drafted a plan for a small airborne unit to parachute behind enemy lines and attack the particularly German Italian airfields. And so it was Bill Stirling. Obviously he had fear of General Smith and Wavell, who handed over this proposal, and it was accepted. They saw validity, and David Stirling, or the two Stirlings, were authorized to raise a unit of 6 officers and 60 men. And Bill Stirling by this time was in his 30s. He considered himself too old to lead it himself. But David, in his mid-20s, was very much was enthusiastic. David was physically brave, and he was desperate to find a role for himself, to come out of a shadow of Bill and also his mother, who was I suppose an alpha female, and really before the war, David had been what was known in the vernacular of the time as a lounge lizard, a bit of a waster, a bit of a loafer, a quitter. And so Bill really encouraged David. So
this is the key, really, isn't it? This is, sorry to interrupt again, but this is the key, isn't it? This is where Bill is the main driver, and David is kind of looking for a direction in life. Absolutely.
That's a good way of putting it. Bill took, as he had throughout his life, Bill took David under his wing. I think Bill recognized he was a very intelligent man, a very perceptive man. I think he recognized David's character flaws, his immaturity, his insecurity, his impatience, his inability to see a task through. He was very imaginative, David, but he would get impatient if things didn't go away straight away. So Bill took David under his wing, and the joke was, in the early days throughout the war, the SAS stood for Stirling and Stirling, because the two of them had founded it together, and there's plenty of evidence of this. Roy Farron, who was one of the great SAS officers, he was in 2 SAS, the regiment formed by Bill Stirling in May 1943. He, in his 1948 memoir, which I highly recommend, Winged Dagger, refers to the co-founders of the SAS, David and Bill. And Charles Johnson, who was worked at the British Embassy alongside Peter Stirling, wrote a memoir in the 1960s, and he describes living. For a time he shared a flat with the Stirlings, and says what a wonderful experience that was. But again, describes the SAS as the brainchild of Bill and David. And so Bill took a back seat, but nonetheless his influence, his fingerprints are over the SAS. How? Well, look at the composition of the 6 officers recruited in the summer of 1941. One of them was Charles Bonington. Now, Charles Bonington was the only one among the 6 who was not a commando officer. And for many years, it intrigued me. How come Charles Bonington, by the way, was the father of the great British mountaineer of his generation, Chris Bonington. But how on earth did this chap come to be in the SAS as an officer when the others, McGonigal, Fraser, Paddy Mayne, David Stirling and Jock Lewis, had come from the commandos, from Lay Force? And one thing I discovered in researching the Stirling biography was that because Charles Bonington had enlisted in 1939 as an infantryman in the Australian Imperial Force, and then had been commissioned in early 1941 once he'd been in the Middle East. Well, the answer to that question is that Charles Bonington was a good friend of Bill Stirling's at Ampleforth. They were in the same year together, and they were the outstanding pupils in their year. So that's how Charles Bonington came to be recruited. They obviously bumped into one another in Cairo, possibly on the terrace of Shepherd's Hotel over a John Collins cocktail, or perhaps gambling at the racecourse. But anyway, Bill Stirling suggested to Charles that he might like to join the SAS. Now, the evidence that it was Bill Stirling who recruited the officers is Paddy Mayne. Paddy Mayne had, as I said earlier, had joined Number 11 Scottish Commando, subsequently Lay Force. They had taken part in the only worthwhile operation in the Middle East in 1941, and that was the battle for Litani River in Syria, when they come ashore and after a fairly brief but bloody engagement, they secured the bridge from the Vichy to hold it for the advance of the main Australian division that was landing. And but the second in command of the Number 11 Scottish Commando was a chap, Major Geoffrey Keyes, who, like David Stirling, was an aristocrat, and like David Stirling, was not cut out for commando warfare. Highly strung, entitled, arrogant, physically brave, and indeed he would win a Victoria Cross in late 1941 for a rather brave but fairly shambolic and poorly organised attempt to kidnap Rommel from his headquarters in Libya. Shocking intelligence. Rommel wasn't there, and anyway, Keyes was killed. But Keyes and Mayne just did not see eye to eye, and Mayne did not like the British upper class, and he confronted Keyes in the mess, and legend has it that he punched Keyes, but he didn't. He just, as if he were on the rugby field, he fended him off and sort of gave him a mild push and told him to get out of here. But anyway, that was enough to lead to his leaving the commando, Scottish Commando. And he wasn't in the glass house. He wasn't under arrest. Another common misconception. He was simply waiting. He'd applied for a transfer to the Far East to link up with Mike Calvert, who would later be the brigadier of the SAS in 1945, and at the time was teaching jungle warfare in the Far East. But instead, Bill Stirling came and had heard of Mayne's fighting reputation, probably knew him pre-war. Bill Stirling was a rugby fan. Bill Stirling invited Blair Mayne, too many bees, to join the SAS. He accepted, and unfortunately he did, because I think, as I write in the book, without the first SAS raid in November 1941 was an unmitigated disaster. 34 of the 55 men who parachuted into Libya to attack a series of German and Italian airfields were either killed or captured. Only 21 returned, one of whom was Paddy Mayne. And had Paddy Mayne been killed or captured in that first raid, I have no doubt whatsoever that the SAS would have been disbanded and we would not have heard of them today.
Well, this is what's comes across in the book, which I found quite. It's quite funny the way you write about it. The methods that are used by the two men, Paddy Mayne and David Stirling, are it's almost as if Paddy Mayne seems to come up with a sort of ruthless execution of a very good plan, and David Stirling's attempts are sort of almost copying him, but bungling his way through North Africa. At one point stumbling across a couple of sleeping Italian sentries and mistakes like that, which are in complete contrast to the story, to the myth that you described at the beginning, with David Stirling being this brilliant guerrilla fighter. It's the gaping chasm between the reality and the legend is amazing.
Well, that's right, and I think that's one way. A question that people are entitled to ask is, well, Gavin, you've been writing about the SAS for the wartime SAS for nigh on 20 years. Why now? And it's because I've matured as a writer and as a man. I was in my late 20s when I started, and I liken it to being confronted with a giant jigsaw puzzle with all the pieces jumbled up, and it's taken me a long time to assemble the pieces. And part of that, Ollie is quite right, is going back into particularly the Phoney Major, which was a book written by Stirling, collaboration with Virginia Cowles, who was an American society author, who was she was rather sycophantic to the British upper class, and she did a wonderful job of portraying Stirling as the archetypal British, I suppose the buccaneer of Elizabethan legend of the 16th century, of the Drake, the Raleigh, the going around the world and laying waste to Spanish galleons, etc. With good humour and English pluck and etc. And yet, when you actually go back to the operation reports, to what has been written, touched on briefly in other books, is the bungling nature of Stirling. So it took Stirling 6 months to bag any planes, in other words, to blow anything up worthwhile. Paddy Mayne, meanwhile, once after the disaster of the first raid in November 41, that's when the SAS partnered with the Long Range Desert Group. The Long Range Desert Group would drive them in the back of their Chevrolet or their Ford trucks to within walking distance of the target, and the SAS would then go in on foot and plant their bombs on the aircraft, and then withdraw to the prearranged rendezvous with the Long Range Desert Group. On the first raid of that type, Paddy Mayne and 5 men destroyed 24 aircraft, and then they saw a thin strip of light. You have to imagine that everything was pitch darkness. And upon further investigation, this was the door of a mess of a German air squadron. Paddy Mayne kicked open the door, and there, looking up at him, were the faces of a couple of dozen German aircrew, absolutely bemused at this giant man standing before them. And Paddy Mayne, in his quiet, soft Irish brogue, said good evening, and then opened fire, and which was very effective. That's what guerrilla warfare is. It's not only destroying the enemy materially and the men, but it's also sowing fear and alarm into the enemy, particularly when they think they are miles behind, they are safe, that they are miles from the enemy. On that same night, David Stirling fell into a slit trench containing 2 Italian sentries and was chased off his airfield at Sirte. 2 weeks later, Mayne returned to the same airfield, this time destroyed 27 aircraft. Stirling returned to the same airfield, and this time wandered into a minefield. When one of his men, Johnny Cooper, realized they were in a minefield, he whispered, "Tell the boss that we're in a minefield," and this was passed up to Stirling. Upon hearing that they're in a minefield, Stirling stood up and in a loud voice saying, "What's that? What's that you say, minefield?" And the Italian sentry started firing. So this is what we're dealing with here. And so what did Stirling do? Well, at the beginning of 1942, he appointed Paddy Mayne the training officer. They'd got some new recruits, a detachment of 50 Frenchmen, and but that was really that absurd thing to do. It's like having your leading goal scorer in a football team and putting him on the subs bench. You have him out front scoring goals, but David Stirling was already envious of Paddy Mayne, and he wanted to be the big man, and unfortunately it just wasn't within his capabilities. So he went on a raid to Borat, a port that ended in disaster. 2 months later he went to Benghazi, similar result. So he was forced to get Mayne back scoring goals, in other words destroying aircraft, which he did with ease. And the outcome of this was that Stirling withdrew even more from the SAS. I mentioned earlier that he'd shared a flat with his two brothers. Bill Stirling, incidentally, had been summoned back to the UK at the beginning of November 1941, 2 weeks before that inaugural operation. I've no doubt that if Bill Stirling had still been in Cairo, because they were warned, Stirling was warned of this impending storm. And that's the reason I overlooked that point earlier. The reason that first raid was a disaster was because it coincided, unfortunately, with one of the heaviest storms in a generation in that part of North Africa. Stirling was given the chance to abort, but he was by nature a gambler. Throughout his military career, he was willing to gamble with the lives of his men, something which Paddy Mayne was not. And had Bill Stirling been there in Cairo, I've no doubt that he would have said, no, let's abort the operation. Far better. I know it's frustrating, but far better the risk for lives of your men. And so as Stirling withdrew even more, intimidated by Paddy Mayne, overpowered by Paddy Mayne, psychologically, emotionally, he just really lived in Cairo, and he led the life of the dandy, and he surrounded himself. And what that led to was his recruiting to the SAS, in effect, his friends. So you had Randolph Churchill, not a guerrilla fighter. Fitzroy MacLean, very courageous man, did some wonderful work behind the lines in Yugoslavia, but not an SAS officer. George Jellicoe, in contrast, was a brilliant officer who would lead the Special Boat Squadron in 1943 and 1944 with great skill and courage. But he rarely went to Kabrit, which was where the SAS were based, 80 miles east of Cairo. And it was he started to go on these increasingly absurd adventures. And the war became almost a game to Stirling, and he was very lucky to escape with his life until, of course, in January 1943 he was captured. And interestingly, I quote a letter in the book from Bill Stirling to their mother, where he expresses his relief that David he's captured, but he's alive. Because he, as he says to his mother, he was becoming ever more adventurous, and really what he was becoming was he was taking more and more risks, not just with his own life, but with the lives of his men under his command.
Which I guess he continues to do throughout his military career. He's rather a sad figure when in captivity. He is homesick, isn't he? Which shows a side of him, I guess, that we're not really aware of, and at least I certainly wasn't aware of.
No, I mean he wasn't. He wasn't just homesick as a POW. Ollie, he wrote to us. What was fascinating glimpses into the character of Stirling is that in November, just on the eve of that inaugural SAS operation, he wrote to his mother and he said to her, really probably along with Bill, the only person that he could reveal his true side. I haven't been this homesick since I was at Ampleforth. And of course, Bill wasn't there. Bill had just returned to England. And that's right. And that's why I do have a degree of sympathy for Stirling. He was a sensitive man. He had an artistic side. He was deeply insecure. He, before and after the war, really rather aimless. He didn't know what to do with his life. And the war gave him a meaning. And and I think this is why Bill Stirling encouraged him so much, because he wanted to give David a purpose in life, and he saw that taking command of a special forces unit would perhaps focus his mind, and it did for a while. But as I said, he then was confronted with Paddy Mayne, the natural leader, and so he once more became this diffident, immature, and an uncertain boy, really. And that again showed itself as a POW. So how did he try and mask these insecurities? Well, like so many insecure people, by an exaggerated cockiness, bravado, even arrogance. I know best, listen to me. And he had this swagger with him and this side of his character, which, coupled with his immense height, he was 6'4.5", and not particularly broad, but and he had this penetrating stare, was quite intimidating. And I've spoken to several people who said that he had this way of looking at you and making you feel that you were so important, and that what he was asking of you, he didn't bark orders, but really he needed you to do this for him, for king and country, and it was hard to resist him. And one of the words is that frequently comes up among the officer class: Fitzroy MacLean, Jellicoe, David Lloyd Owen, who later commanded the Long Range Desert Group, very distinguished men in their own right, is I fell under his spell. And this is the thing with Stirling. He had this strange charisma that, of course, didn't work in his big brother, didn't work in his mother, and didn't work on Paddy Mayne. They saw him for what he was, which is this insecure, immature, rather frightened young man. And I think more than anything, David Stirling wanted to be respected by Paddy Mayne. But Paddy Mayne didn't have much respect for Stirling, because he saw through him.
Yeah, he comes across as a sort of consummate professional. But one area that Paddy Mayne has been accused of over the years, and I suspect you're going to tell me the origin of these kind of accusations, is that he would like alcohol, get drunk, and then start fighting. Now, that's not necessarily a fair depiction of Paddy Mayne, is it?
No, it's not. He liked to drink, but he was very, as I said earlier about Paddy Mayne, he had great control under fire. He could control himself. And in recent years, there's been insinuations and suggestions that he went into battle fortified by drink. Absolute nonsense. I've spoken to many veterans who fought with Paddy Mayne throughout the war, and none of them ever remembered him drinking in operations. In the mess, yes, he had some. He was well, I mean, he was a rugby player, for goodness sake, so he could neck the beer, but he was very disciplined in when to drink and when not to drink. Of course, he wasn't alone in that. There was alcohol was traditionally there's been some good nights in the sergeant's mess and the officers' mess down the centuries. But this is all part of, as I said, in the last 30 or 40 years, these nasty, snide insinuations that have emerged about Paddy Mayne, that he was misogynistic, that he was homosexual, that he was a drunk, that he was brutal, that he was a very unhappy man. They're just not true. And he was very balanced. And one thing that people must remember is that he, unlike Stirling, who before the war, as I mentioned, was a loafer and a quitter, Paddy Mayne was anything but. So he was not only playing rugby for Ireland and the British Lions, going on a 4-month tour to South Africa in 1938, where incidentally he played in, it was 21 of the 24 games, extraordinary durability, was a star performer, the only player that the South African media, British player, an Irish player, raved about.
Second rower, wasn't he a second rower? Sorry.
Second row, yeah. Probably today he'll be in the back row. He was about 6'2", 15.5 stone, but very athletic. And he was a champion. He was a heavyweight boxing champion of Ireland and lost in the final of the British University's heavyweight division. But he was a qualified solicitor. He was a very intelligent man. And when he was at Queen's in Belfast, he was elected onto the student council. So that's an accolade that shows you how much he was respected by his peers. That he wasn't just an athlete; he was an intellect too. And yet, to read some of the descriptions in Mayne, and I have to say some of them come from David Stirling. They began in the 1980s when Stirling really began to, as I say in the book, he actually began to still Mayne's valour and still his character, so that by the end of Stirling's life, he was Paddy Mayne and Paddy Mayne was Stirling, this narcissistic, misogynistic, insecure, depressive. That's David Stirling. It's not Paddy Mayne. And unfortunately, this now has become common currency. I would say that it's rare to read about Paddy Mayne these days, about someone, a description of him as a psychopath, a misfit, a gangster, and other such nonsense.
Absolutely. The raid that you describe, where he sees the shaft of light and says "Good evening," that's something straight out of James Bond. Now, incidentally,
can I just add something to that, actually, Ollie, which I think is quite important, because that was used in the 90s. That has been used by Stirling himself, actually, when he collaborated with a book about Rogue Warrior of the SAS, written in the 1980s. And he said that he described Mayne as callous, and he was referring to that incident. Now, there's nothing callous about it. That's what guerrillas do. You kill the enemy. And but what that overlooks is what David Stirling did himself a few months later at, I think it was Benina Airdrome, when he, desperate to emulate Paddy Mayne, kicked open the door of it was a sleeping quarter, and asleep in the bunks were a dozen or so German aircrew, and Stirling rolled in a grenade, and along with share this among you. Now, what's more callous, killing sleeping men, or as Paddy Mayne did, saying good evening and then opening fire? And as I say in the book, Paddy Mayne, yes, he was clinical in combat, but when he took a man's life, he looked him in the eyes. Stirling rolled in a grenade as men slept. So for Stirling, now of course you could say, well, again, Stirling, that's guerrilla warfare. They were killing the enemy as well as destroying their aircraft. But for Stirling to accuse Mayne of being this cold-blooded killer when he himself had done something like that is hypocritical.
So I want to move on to Stirling after the war, because it's the story continues to be interesting well after the war. And this is where he really makes the SAS into almost a mercenary force, and solidifies the SAS in the minds of, I guess within the military. They weren't necessarily famous outside of the army then. But yeah, could you talk a little bit about what he did in the 1960s with the SAS?
Yeah, certainly. He was he tried to launch a something called the Capricorn Africa Society in 1949, which was rather a vague idea of trying to. It was a sort of benign colonialism in southern Africa. Anyway, it failed, and so he was again. I keep coming back to this word lost, aimless. So what does he do? Well, in the 1960s, he begins to dabble in what we would describe as mercenaries, and he at the time in the Yemen, this is 1963, the royalists were battling Egyptian-backed republicans, and this was at a time when Britain was you had Nasser in Egypt, and they were increasingly concerned about the spread of socialism, communism within the Middle East and Africa. So Stirling saw an opportunity to enrich by providing the Yemen royalist forces with mercenaries, and this is what he did using his SAS contacts, and three troopers from the 22 SAS were actually spirited out of Britain to take part in a guerrilla operation against Egyptian aircraft, and this was done. Initially, the British government sort of turned a blind eye, but then it erupted at the same time as Stirling was formulating this plan. The Profumo affair broke, and with John Profumo and the Christine Keeler, and a huge scandal at the time. The Conservatives were desperate to avoid any more unwanted publicity, so they ordered Stirling to scrap his operation. He just ignored them. Stirling was in the habit of ignoring people. During the war, he ignored an order from Mountbatten to return from Cairo to London. If he didn't want to obey an order, he would simply ignore it. And so, and he was throughout the 60s. He was involved in other deals, one with the Saudi government, all of which made him quite a rich man. But of course, brought in Libya after Colonel Gaddafi came to power in Libya in 1969. In 1970, Stirling again tried to raise a mercenary force featuring many former members of the SAS to go and free 150 Libyan rebels in the hope of fomenting a revolution against Gaddafi. This incurred the wrath of the American government and then the British government. Stirling once more ignored them, and in the end, the Italian had to arrest the mercenaries when they came to Italy prior to launching their operation. So he really was dragging the name of the SAS, if not into the gutter, he was certainly damaging it. And I think it's instructive that in the late, I think it was 1979, the then director of the SAS, Peter de la Billière, who was later become quite well known during the first Gulf War, wrote to the Daily Telegraph to say, we are, because there's been so much adverse publicity about the SAS, we're not a paramilitary unit, we are a regiment within the British Army, and really that whole the start of that degradation of their reputation stems back to Stirling in the 60s. Now, a year later, of course, there is the Iranian embassy siege in May 1980. And that's when 6 terrorists seized 26 hostages in the Iranian embassy in South Kensington. And there's a 6-day siege. And at the end of the 6th day, one of the hostages is killed. Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister, sends in the SAS, and in a matter of minutes, captured on global TV, they end the siege. And those images of black-clad men abseiling down the pristine white exterior of the embassy captured the world's imagination. And that began really what today we can call the cult of the SAS. You know, they're barely off the TV screen. There's one reality TV show after another. I mean, you know, an entire rainforest has been pulped to make books about the SAS. And of course, Stirling jumped on that bandwagon and once more was able to a new generation to sell himself as the sole founder of the SAS and their greatest ever fighter.
There's one film that was made in the wake of the Iranian embassy siege, which I cannot help but love, is Who Dares Wins with Lewis Collins. But
yeah, 1992, I think that's right.
Yeah. So one other thing I wanted to ask, because I know we're running out of time now, but Stirling's activities in the 1970s, he didn't particularly like the Harold Wilson government, viewing them as rather too left-wing for his liking. And could you talk a little bit about the organization that he was involved with in, essentially, we're talking close to a military coup here, aren't we, during the 70s?
Well, that's certainly how it was styled by the Labour government and the much of the press at the time. That's right. In the early 1970s, we had it was a time of great economic strife. Britain was a sick man of Europe, and there was a groundswell of opinion that Britain was going to the dogs, and it was the socialists were within months of seizing power. The first figure to warn of such an event was General Sir Walter Walker, who in the early 60s had become something of a military celebrity for leading British forces in Borneo against insurgents. And in 1984, he formed the Civil Assistance, which was funded by public donations. And it was a sort of I mean, how would you describe it? It was like not a militia, that's too dramatic, but it was usually ex-military types who feared a communist takeover and signed up to almost like a home guard in the event of a communist takeover of Britain. Stirling then jumped on the bandwagon and formed GB 75. Now, the difference between the two was that his was funded privately by wealthy businessmen, many of his friends. And this I think probably does fit the description of a private army. And it was to seize power seize back power in the event that the hard left would take control of Britain. And they would then they were trained. They were going to start training in urban warfare, ready for when the communists controlled Britain. Now, when this was revealed in the summer of 1974, it caused an immense hoo-ha. It was labelled by politicians as a quasi-fascist organisation. Stirling was described as Colonel Blimp in many tabloids. And I think it was very much unprepared for the furore that erupted, because for many years he'd interfered in the politics in, as we just said, in likes of Yemen and in Kenya and Oman and southern Africa. And here he was meddling in the domestic politics of Britain, and it caused a scandal really, And so Stirling quickly disbanded his organisation, GB75. That was GB75 was when he thought in 1975 that the communist uprising would take place, and it just petered out, and that was yeah. I mean, I suppose in a way it was another good example of Stirling thinking to himself perhaps in the bar of whites, my goodness, coming up with an idea, but not thinking it through. And I think this was characteristic of Stirling throughout his life. He had a very fertile imagination, particularly when it came to promoting himself. But I think it was Peter Stirling, his brother, who I quote in the book, saying the thing with David was that he needed to be controlled. And I think that's so true throughout his life. And Bill Stirling was able to control him in the early days of his military career. And then when he left to go back to Britain in 1941, Stirling became increasingly uncontrollable because he just didn't listen to people. And so I mean that links quite dovetails quite nicely into the embassy siege, because in the late 70s, yet again, David Stirling was a man without a mission, a man without a purpose. And he was still relatively, what he'd have been 60, so still relatively young. And of course, the embassy siege meant that for the last decade of his life, he died in 1990, he was knighted in 1989 for services to the military, that he was able to live once more off the SAS fame, but in reality, the fame of others.
So I wanted to ask one final question of you, Gavin, and that's really your book is certainly a new interpretation or a new history of David Stirling, the founder of the SAS. And I wondered what you think you'll get, what kind of blowback you'll get from the SAS themselves. Do you think this is going to be a challenge for you?
Well, I mean, I certainly I hope it's not a book that upsets anyone. It's impeccably researched, if I do say so myself. It's a fruition of the first SAS veteran I interviewed was Malcolm Pladle, the doctor, in 1942. I interviewed him in 1998, so that's nearly a quarter of a century. I certainly, what the evolution of the SAS in the Second World War is extraordinary, from being a unit of 66 officers and men in the summer of 1941 to ending as a brigade of 2,500 men, 2 regiments, 2 French regiments and a Belgian company, and is testament to the caliber of officer and men who served in the SAS. And they achieved very impressive results in Sicily and Italy, and in France in particular, I think in the summer of 1944, parachuting into occupied France and then training and organizing the Maquis, and then with the Maquis launching a coordinated campaign of guerrilla warfare, which really did hinder the Germans as they sought to reinforce the Normandy battlefield. That's superb, and Eisenhower quite rightly commended them for their work. But that was achieved without Stirling. If you actually look at the SAS for the first year of their existence, take away Paddy Mayne and to a lesser extent Bill Fraser, one of the other great figures, and they achieved little, certainly because he was just incompetent. And so I would like to think that I really perhaps revising the revisionist, i.e. David Stirling, who was the first to revise the SAS history with the Phantom Major in 1958, hence my book, The Phoney Major. And he then set about quite willfully and shamelessly denigrating Paddy Mayne, diminishing the role of his brother Bill Stirling, for no other reason than to promote himself. That's unforgivable, and I hope very much that this book will rehabilitate Paddy Mayne and also reveal why Bill Stirling should be regarded as the father of British Special Forces and not his brother David.
Well, Gavin, thank you. It is impeccably researched. It's a great read, and it's almost a, I don't know, it's a real tribute to Paddy Mayne. I think he comes across this as the real star, him and Bill. So I really do recommend this fantastic story.
Thank you very much.
So Gavin, thanks very much. Book's out now.
Books out May the 20th. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it'll be out by the time our listeners are listening.
Yeah. So well, thank you very much, Ollie, because it is important for me to explain the way I think I have in the last hour, I suppose, going behind the scenes in a way, and that it's not a salacious, sensationalized account of David Stirling's life or the wartime history of the SAS, and so I appreciate the platform to put that across, and I hope that if people do buy the book and do read it, they will agree with me that I've helped rehabilitate Paddy Mayne.
I think you have. Thanks, Gavin.
Thank you very much, Ollie.
Well, there you have it. And now the truth is out there about the founding of the SAS. Next week, I'll be speaking to Damien Lewis all about the incredible story of Josephine Baker, the French resistance agent. Until then, thank you and good night.